Hello, hello. Welcome to this session, Assume the Best, how a new theory of humanity is changing how we report, respond, and run newsrooms. We are at the Mental Health in Journalism Summit, in Spanish, Cumbre de Salud Mental en el Periodismo, because this is a summit that is happening in two languages, in English and in Spanish. And it's the second day of this summit that is lasting 3 days, and I'm very happy to have you here. I'm Mar Cabra, the Executive Director of the Self-Investigation, and the Self-Investigation is a nonprofit that promotes mental health and well-being in the media worldwide. This summit is sponsored by the Fred Foundation. You can see our logos here at the bottom of the screen, and it's done in collaboration with all the partners that you're seeing on the screen, more than 30 media organizations, media support organizations from all over the world, and some other partners who are making this summit a reality. 3 days together, day 2 today, it's October 9th. If you're watching this live, today we're starting with this session, a block specifically thinking about solutions. What's being done? We're on it because mental health is an urgent issue in the media. That's what we saw yesterday. Today, we're going to focus on what is being done. And let me give a spoiler alert. A lot is being done from all over the world. We're going to have examples from Southeast Asia, Latin America, North America, and Europe. Actually, the speaker joining us today will be joining us from Germany. And if you want to spread the word today or throughout these days about the summit, please use the hashtag MHJS24, which is the acronym for Mental Health in Journalism Summit. So hopefully that's easy to remember. Important also to highlight that we are working together with the whole community on a pledge, Mental Health in Journalism pledge. We're basically crafting together a document that highlights 3 main points about fostering a culture that prioritizes mental health within the journalism community. We're pledging support for journalists in accessing resources and costs on these topics, and also another point about prioritizing mental health so that it's an essential to the journalistic excellence and integrity. You can read the whole pledge and offer your comments here in this URL that you're seeing on the screen, and you also have it on the chat. We have the pledge open for comments from the community, to all of you throughout the day. And tomorrow, which is October 10th, World Mental Health Day, we're going to share it with the whole public, and we're going to be getting people to sign it because we want everyone working in the media in any corner of the world to know and to signal the fact that mental health is a priority and should be a business and strategic priority for all media organizations. So those are some reminders about the summit. We're starting the whole day to now with this amazing session that is going to be led by Emma Thomasson, who's joining me on screen today from Berlin. Hola, Emma.
Hola, Ma.
So thank you, Emma, for joining again her session, Assume the Best, how a new theory of humanity is changing how we report, respond, and run newsrooms. Emma is trainer and coach at the Self-Investigation, and she does a lot of other things that she's going to tell you about, because I'm not calling her old, I'm just calling her experienced. She's been in journalism for a while. So Emma, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Ma. So yeah, my name is Emma Thomasson, and I'm a recovering doom scroller. I'm a former Reuters bureau chief and correspondent, and I now work as a consultant trainer and coach focusing on leadership and mental health. I'm also a mother of 2 teenagers, and we live in Berlin. So today I want to tell you why we need to assume the best. The glass is half full, not half empty. I want to change how we build resilience on a personal level, how we run newsrooms, and how we report. So I have been a Prince fan since my teens, so I'm going to start this talk with a lyric from my former idol. In his song 1999, Prince predicted that the new millennium would bring Judgment Day and the sky would turn purple, a bit like my jumper. 25 years ago, in 1999, the world was gripped by a strange panic. Many people thought that a computer bug meant planes would fall from the sky, nuclear plants would malfunction, and chaos would reign on the first day of 2000. This programming glitch was dubbed the Y2K bug, and journalists like me spent a lot of time in 1999 reporting on how this was going to blow up the world. I was living in South Africa back then. I visited a farmer who was so worried that he had stockpiled food, water, weapons, and chickens in preparation for Armageddon. He was fortifying fences and told me he feared being overrun by desperate, hungry people when law and order collapsed in the new year. Meanwhile, governments and businesses were spending billions to fix the bug. South African Airways was so keen to prove that it was ready for Y2K and that its planes weren't about to fall out of the sky that it invited executives and journalists like me to fly over Cape Town on a flight of fantasy to celebrate the new year. They removed seats to make space for a band, and we tried to quell our nerves by dancing as the clock ticked down towards midnight and the plane circled over Table Mountain. Before I tell you what happened next on Judgment Day, I want to ask you some questions. So I'm going to ask you to look at this Mentimeter poll. You can click on the QR code, or you can connect with the link in the chat to go to menti.com and enter the code you can see here, 74502570. So the questions: all things considered, do you think the world is getting better or worse, or neither better nor worse? Next, what happened to the global forest area in the last 30 years? Did it decrease by about 50%, or 30%, or 10%? Do you believe most people can be trusted? Do you believe stress is bad for you? And what values motivate you to do your job in journalism? Now, I'm just going to pause for a second to give you a chance to answer those questions. Paula, perhaps you could share the results as they're coming in now. Okay, so as I suspected, most people think the world is getting worse. If we could look at the next slide. Most people think forests are disappearing fast. I'll give you the correct answer later. And the next one. Not many of you trust other people. And finally, about stress. And most people believe stress is bad for you. We'll take a look at your values later. So if we could go back to my slides now, that would be great. So 25 years ago, it looks like quite a lot of you might have wanted to join the South African farmer behind his fence. But I had decided to take Prince's advice, to party like it's 1999. Here I am drinking champagne in the air above Cape Town. I'm still a bit nervous, even if I don't believe that the Y2K bug means it is Judgment Day. In the end, midnight arrived without event. We watched the fireworks explode far below us around Table Mountain and landed safely in the early hours of 2000. The Y2K bug was quickly forgotten. Thankfully, the farmer didn't get to use his guns on a hungry mob. It sometimes takes courage to assume the best. Why am I telling you this story? Well, doomsday thinking is as old as humankind. Negative assumptions about the future and human nature are baked into our psychology, our economics, and our religions. They're reinforced by hard-nosed journalists, not to mention algorithms that play on fear and loathing. And that cynicism is growing, undermining trust in institutions, including the media and democracy. I'm not saying journalists were wrong to warn of the dangers of Y2K, even if it seems like a bit of a joke looking back now. It was a serious threat, and governments spent billions fixing systems so that my plane could land safely. But too much doomsday thinking is bad for our own mental health, for the atmosphere in our newsrooms, and for the business of journalism. It's also bad for democracy. I worked for most of my career for the news agency Reuters, where all journalists have to sign up to the trust principles that aspire to integrity, independence, and freedom from bias. I've come to question whether freedom from bias is attainable or even desirable, and the pretense of it doesn't seem to be helping journalists to win the trust of our audiences. When we think of freedom from bias, we usually mean political bias, but we don't often consider one of the most powerful biases that drive all humans, reporters included, namely our negativity bias. As we just saw in the poll, most of us assume that things will probably turn out for the worst and that people around us have bad intentions. I'm going to show you why we need to do more to understand our overactive negativity bias and counter it with some positive balance. That is essential for the future of journalism and the mental health of those who practice it. Humans have an inbuilt warning system that helps us scan for threats. That was useful when we were at risk of attack from a saber-toothed tiger. However, while our environments have become safer, parts of our brains are still stuck in the Stone Age. So headlines about war, political turbulence, climate disaster tip us into flight, fight, or freeze, even if we're relatively safe and secure now. As the poll showed, most people believe the world is getting worse. The last time this survey was conducted on a global level, in 2016, only 11% of people thought the world was getting better. And that was before the pandemic, Ukraine, Gaza, and mounting signs of global warming. Brain scans show we quickly store negative events in our long-term memory, but we need to think actively about positive events for 12 seconds or more to store them away. Can you remember the last inspiring news story you read or heard? Type it in the chat if you can remember. Psychologist Rick Hanson says most positive experiences flow through the brain like water through a sieve, while negative ones are caught every time. We also tend to believe that people who spread negativity are smarter. Researchers call this the cynical genius illusion. It's hardly surprising that cynicism is held in such high regard, given that popular culture is full of characters like Sherlock Holmes, House MD, Frank Underwood. Maybe I should stop watching House of Cards with my son. He did ask me the other day, do American politicians really bribe and murder people to get to the top? Journalism often rewards such cynical geniuses. Perhaps that's why I'm nervous about coming out of the closet as a proponent of a more balanced worldview in front of an audience of journalists. I'm afraid of being seen as stupidly naive. I feel a bit like the film director Richard Curtis. He said, if you make a film about a man kidnapping a woman and chaining her to a radiator for 5 years, it's called a searingly realistic analysis of society. If I make a film like Love Actually, which is about people falling in love, it's called a sentimental presentation of an unrealistic world. I know from experience the professional risk of proposing stories with an upbeat angle. When the first wave of COVID started to subside, I wanted to write about the declining infection rates. I was definitely biased on this. I was desperate for my kids to get back to school. But one of my editors sneered at my suggestion, saying it was no longer much of a story. I realized I'd become a professional doom scroller, and it was time to do something different. After leaving Reuters, I stopped following the news for a few months. I even questioned whether I still wanted to be a journalist. But then I realized that I want to help build a better future for the news business. By changing how we report, how we run newsrooms, and how we build resilience on a personal level. I have seen the power of challenging our negativity bias, my own mental health, and that of my family. So I think it's worth the risk of challenging the cynical geniuses. I have been inspired by prominent thinkers who say we should promote an assume the best philosophy if we want to heal ourselves and our societies, rather than being imprisoned by our reptilian flight or fight brain. We can actively cultivate a tend and befriend response to threat, as well as an ethos of hope. During the pandemic, society didn't break down as the doom mongers might have predicted, and we saw a surge of offers of neighbourly support and rainbows in people's windows. But this is not about toxic positivity or avoiding or suppressing the negative. It's about recognizing that our biases can be misleading and paralyzing. As American writer Rebecca Solnit says, optimists think it will all be fine without our involvement. Pessimists take the opposite position. Both excuse themselves from acting. So how can we build resilience on a personal level? That is essential given the epidemic of burnout that is driving many colleagues to quit the profession. Research shows that cynics earn less, suffer more depression, and drink more heavily. Sounds like a lot of journalists I know. They're also more likely to die young and less likely to take part in protests or to vote. Meanwhile, stress is bad for us, right? That was what most of you answered in the poll. And we're drowning in stress. 40% of Gen Zs say they feel stressed all or most of the time. In fact, the belief that stress is bad for you is more dangerous than the stress itself. A Stanford University study of more than 28,000 people found that high levels of anxiety and mental tension led to a 43% increase in mortality, but only if the participants believed it was doing them harm. This is a conference on mental health, but we have to be careful not to demonize stress. Not everybody who experiences stress is automatically heading for burnout, and not everybody who witnesses or survives violence will necessarily suffer from post-traumatic stress. And yet people often confuse everyday stress with chronic conditions like trauma or burnout. However, we humans are fundamentally very resilient, especially us journalists. So next time you find yourself putting a negative label on feelings like stress or anxiety, ask yourself, can you give those sensations a different framing, like excitement, for example? Can you imagine you're an athlete about to run a race? This is me after a race. That's what I tried to do before this speech, for example, taking a lesson from tennis great Billie Jean King. You can also try another simple exercise from positive psychology. Most of us journalists didn't start out as cynics, but as idealists who believe their work has meaning and impact. So I asked you, what values drive you to do the often dangerous and underpaid job of journalism? These are some of mine, and perhaps we could share the Mentimeter results at this point to show everybody else's values. So yeah, we're seeing truth, justice, serving others, hope and courage, lots of sort of positive, inspiring values that motivate us in our work. And it might seem like this is a trivial exercise, reminding yourself of your values. But if we can go back to the slides now, it turns out that our thinking about our values is very protective for our mental health. It can dampen stress, it can increase willpower, it can close achievement gaps, improve accuracy, increase openness. I keep my values on my desk. Believing your work is having an impact can even make you less prone to PTSD. Of course, thinking about your values and reframing stress is not going to end wars, stop climate change, or end the financial worries of many journalists, but it might at least strengthen our resilience to allow us to keep reporting on difficult topics in difficult environments. And when I talk about difficult environments, I'm not just talking about war zones. Many workplaces can often feel like hostile environments. This tendency to assume the worst about a dangerous world is often accompanied by a negative view of human nature. On average, across 30 countries, only 30% of people believe people can be trusted. China and India are outliers on that. I think if you ask many editorial managers, they would also say they don't trust people. A lot of them in my leadership courses say, they ask, how can I deal with the difficult reporters that are in my team? I have seen repeatedly that excellent journalists who are promoted to leadership positions struggle to trust their teams and can become controlling micromanagers. This is a quote from Yukari Kane, from the CEO. She's the CEO of the Prison Journalism Project. She said, what made me a good reporter is that I never trusted anything. Now I'm having to unlearn that, because you do have to trust when you're a manager. Too many managers adopt the same style and values that make for successful investigative journalism in how they run their newsrooms. So they're judgmental, critical, always on the lookout for villains. That often creates toxic environments poisoned by blame, exacerbating the burnout problem. Leaders should instead adopt the style and outlook of constructive journalism. That means cultivating inspiration, curiosity, and finding solutions rather than finding fault. That's why I teach the concepts of empathetic leadership and psychological safety to newsroom managers. And that culture change has to start with the team leader, like Yukari, assuming the best about their reporters and being prepared to admit their own mistakes. Finally, we need to think about the kind of stories we write and the impact they have on our own psyche and that of our audiences. Just over 6 years ago, my then 11-year-old son started hyperventilating. It went on for so long that we took him to hospital. They diagnosed a panic attack. My son had been joining Fridays for Future protests and often found it hard to get to sleep, worrying about an apocalyptic future. I switched off the radio when the kids were around. Then I read the book, Factfulness, Why Things Are Better Than We Think. My son read it too, and I'm sure it contributed to his recovery. The question about the rate of deforestation that you answered in the poll comes from the Factfulness Project. So the correct answer is that the global forest area has decreased by 10% in the last 30 years, but about 93% of people usually get that question wrong and assume trees are being cut down at a faster rate. Why does that matter? Many people have lost hope, so they stop getting involved in environmental action. They also stop reading news about the climate. Of course, we still need to listen to climate scientists warning about the urgent need to act to slow global warming, and trees are disappearing too fast. But if we want to motivate people to act, we should consider using hope rather than fear to communicate. Which of these posters would get you out on the streets? News avoidance is clearly on the rise, especially among young people. So I went into classrooms in Berlin to find out why. Of 50 teenagers in Berlin and London who I asked about the state of the world, only one used one single positive word, innovative. You can see the tone of most of the answers. How should journalists respond? Surveys show that people want more reports that give them a sense of hope. In the United States, for example, over half of under 35s think having stories that make them feel better about the world is very or extremely important. This is not a new preference. I was lucky enough to report on one of the most inspiring stories of our generation, the end of apartheid in South Africa and the process of reconciliation led by Nelson Mandela. Who do teenagers look to for inspiration these days? Well, it's internet sensations like Mr. Beast, who has attracted 26 billion views on YouTube, including with charitable stunts. His videos include giving a homeless person $10,000, funding cataract surgeries for 1,000 blind people. I know Mr. Beast is an entertainer, not a journalist, but he knows how to inspire his audiences. Journalists for too long have assumed that they are only responsible for delivering rational facts and not thinking about the emotions of their audiences, as if the two can ever really be separated. That's why Dmitry Shishkin's user needs model is helpful. I'm glad to say many newsrooms are more actively reporting on potential solutions, even from war zones, and this is helping some of them retain or win back subscribers. It's true that readers are more likely to click on an alarmist headline, but they're more likely to engage with news that inspires them. So I come back to print. Faced with Judgment Day, his recommendation was to dance. A colleague from Lebanon, who is running coverage of the current violence in the Middle East, told me recently that she's decided to make time for ballet classes to stay sane. This is not about dancing ourselves into oblivion, but about allowing ourselves to believe that it's okay to dance and to see the positive in ourselves, in our colleagues, and in the world, so we can play our role in defending democracy and the planet. So the next time you find yourself trapped by the cynical genius illusion, remember it's smarter to allow yourself to trust others and believe that a better future is possible, to assume the best, at least some of the time. So here's a nicer glass half full. I believe this can make for healthier journalists, happier newsrooms, and more hopeful stories. Thank you very much for listening.
Gracias, Emma. I'm clapping for the whole audience who I'm sure have been inspired by this amazing talk. And let me just jump actually to one of the questions from Joanna asking whether it's different for wire journalists and journalists in the newsroom, whether there's more challenges for those who are working in wires.
I think working for a wire means you're not so connected with your audience, actually. So, because there's, often there's another stage, there's somebody who's choosing which stories to take from the wire. I think that often means like you just feel like you're kind of reporting into a vacuum. And I think that makes for frustration, actually, sometimes, because it's for example, my case of sort of suggesting that we should, during COVID, be reporting on the declining figures as well as on the spikes in the infection rates. I couldn't prove it, I couldn't say, well, people are going to read these stories, because we don't have that direct connection with the audience. So yeah, that's the first thing that comes to mind.
Thank you, Emma. Let me just pull up some of the comments in the chat. Very inspiring. Totally makes sense. Thank you, Emma. Thank you really to the audience following the session for all this support. And we are going to be on time so that you can jump on to the next thing. Let me just say that we have a whole block of sessions up to 5:30 p.m. or 6 p.m. today in Central Eastern Europe. That's, Central Time in Europe. So anyway, we have many hours of programming just in English for you. Coming up next in the summit, you have the 5 sessions that you have there on the screen. So you have to choose one of them. And if you're following us on YouTube and you're like, okay, but how do I access them? Well, you need to be registered at the summit, because this is free but requires registration so that you can log in the platform SCED that we're using. So just go to mhjournalismsummit.org if you haven't done so already to register. Let me just say that it's pretty simple to just access the sessions. You click on a session, then you have the information there, and it says open Zoom. Click on that, and that's how you should be able to access that information. Also know that many sessions are recorded if you can't watch them or you want to watch some of them later, because of course we have 5 parallel sessions happening at the same time. You can pre-register to access the session recordings, which will be available from next week. And of course, if you're watching us on YouTube, just subscribe to this channel, so that you can really access any recordings that we have throughout the summit. We're going to be hosting the plenary sessions in YouTube so that you can spread the word. So with that, Emma, I'm bringing you back to stage to once again give a big round of applause. Thank you, and thank you for bringing positivity into this complex world that we have to deal with as journalists.
Thanks a lot, Mar.
Bye, Emma. Bye, everyone. I hope you enjoy the other sessions. Bye-bye.